So I think we officially have about 3 minutes before we start. I was wondering if there's any questions I can answer up front while we're all sitting here waiting. Or not. Yeah. Sure, if you want to follow along, the best thing to do would probably be launch VS. I'm going to do all that from scratch. But if you have the Northwinds database installed, that's the database I was planning on using, just because most people seem to have that. Yeah. Good question. The question is, will any of the Atlas controls work with 1.1 or 1.0? The server-side controls won't work there. I mean, you can use any of the 1.1 controls in ASP.NET 2.0 with Atlas. You can't take the actual Atlas controls and run them on a v1.1 framework. What you can do, though, is you can use actually the Atlas client-side scripts with the v1.1 framework. So you can't use the server-side controls, but you can use the client-side because they're just JavaScript. So. Quick question, how many people are actually using ASP.NET 2.0 already? Okay, cool, quite a few people. We're not officially started yet, so this is the preamble. But basically, the structure of this talk is going to be, there's no slides. Instead, it's going to basically be building an app from scratch. And so we'll start saying file new project, and we're going to go ahead and build an end-to-end application. We're going to do some data access, or build a data access layer. We're going to do master pages, implement a navigation system using the site nav system and some of the new menu controls. We'll do master details and filtering, sorting, paging, editing. We'll throw in some Atlas. We'll show some SQL cache invalidation support. So we can go ahead and use full-page output caching, but using database-level invalidations to regenerate the content. I'm going to go ahead and add forms authentication as well as role management. And we'll go ahead and lock down portions of the site depending on roles and add some custom behaviors in terms of allowing data access depending on what role capabilities you're in. And then I'm going to go ahead and add web part support and enable drag-drop portal customization on the homepage. So that's the next hour. And yeah, we're always going to type all that from scratch. But sort of explain as we go. If you already know all that stuff today, this talk might not be for you. Hopefully it'll still be a fun talk and you'll learn something. But I just want to make sure if there's someone here who's an expert in ASP.NET 2.0 today, unless you just want to hear me talk, you know, there might not be brand new stuff that you're going to discover. But it should hopefully be a fun talk and show you kind of the breadth and end-to-end. And I'll discuss along the way some of the different pieces, how they work architecturally, some of the things that we're doing in even a more advanced scenario that you can take advantage of. So anyways, that's the rough structure. Any questions? Can people hear me okay? Is the sound loud enough? Yeah, question over there. Sorry. Sorry. Oh, the wizard control, you mean? Yes. I'm going to show the create wizard control, or the create user wizard control, which is subclass from the wizard control, but I'll talk about that when I get there. Yeah. I'll go into more detail there. Okay, well, I think we're, oh, yeah, one other question. Then we'll get started. Will I post the samples? Yeah, I think this is being webcast. I believe all the talks are being webcast, and I'll also post the samples. Yeah. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. So for those of you who don't remember me from yesterday, I'm Scott Guthrie. I'm the general manager of the .NET Platform Developer Division. And so I run the development teams that build ASP.NET, Atlas, IIS, the Common Language Runtime, .NET Compact Framework, Windows Forms, and some of our Visual Studio tools. And so basically the purpose of this talk is to give you kind of a wide overview of ASP.NET 2.0. And rather than spend a lot of time talking about slides or high-level concepts, basically show you the code. And so I'm going to go ahead and build an app from scratch over the next hour. I'm hoping to make it interactive. So please, as I go along and you have questions and you say, well, but does it do this or how does it work like that? Please do raise your hand and ask along the way. If I think that from a time management perspective, you know, we're only going to get through the first 5% of the content, I might postpone some of the questions till the end. I will stay as long as you have questions. My flight out tonight isn't until 8, so if you do have questions and want to stick around, I'd be more than happy to answer any of them. The other thing is, I'll just call it really quickly, is my blog, which is weblogs.asp.net/ScottGoo. There's lots of good ASP.NET information that I post there. You can also send me email at the below address if there's some question that either you don't think of until later or you don't get a chance to ask. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is basically build an app from scratch. For those of you who just joined, it's going to be a data-driven app. We're going to go ahead and build a data access layer to go against the Northwinds sample database. So hopefully a database people might be familiar with already or are able to download. Then we'll go ahead and build kind of a master page layout to have kind of consistent look and feel. Going to implement master details with category filtering, inserting the data, using the data access layer, accessing it, et cetera. I'm going to show a little bit of Atlas. Some of it's going to be a repeat of what I did yesterday, so I'm not going to go into too much depth there. Then I'm going to go ahead and implement a navigation system. So you can go ahead and build up a menu structure to track where users are in the site and provide kind of a nice hierarchical layout of the site structure. Going to implement security with the Forms Authentication System and a secure credential management store. We're going to go ahead and implement role-based security and show a couple different ways that you can go ahead and restrict access or provide access to different parts of the site based on people's role capabilities. And then I'm going to go ahead and implement drag-drop portal UI for the homepage. Yeah, take us about 60 minutes. So to start off with, I'm just going to go ahead and actually, the other thing I'll mention, everything I'm going to show here today does work with the free Visual Web Developer Express Edition IDE that you can download for free. In this case here, I am using Visual Studio, but all the features I'm going to show here will work with the free version. So a couple quick questions. What language do you want me to build it in? I hear a lot of VB. Okay. What do you want to call it? Hello World. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to use the Atlas icon that you get when you install the Atlas CTP drop from March. And what this does is it gets you a couple files when you install the site. I'm actually just going to delete these 3 default ones. I'm going to leave in the web.config file, which has some of the registration for the new Atlas controls. And I'm also going to leave in this assembly that we add in the bin directory, which is the Atlas server-side DLL. And so basically just leave that in, and then we should be good to go. So to start off with, as I mentioned, we're going to build a data-driven site. I want to use the Northwinds database, which comes as part of SQL Server. You can also download that sample off the web if you just have SQL Express. And for those of you who don't know, it's basically a database with categories, customers, employees, orders, products. It's a fairly trivial database, but it shows a lot of common structures back and forth between the tables. It's going to let us highlight a couple things. A couple different ways in ASP.NET 2.0 that I can go ahead and interact with that database. I can bind to it directly in a 2-tier way. We have a whole bunch of features that are new in ASP.NET 2.0 to make that easy. That's great for hobbyists. It's great for someone who just wants a very quick and dirty site. What I'm going to go ahead and do, though, in this app is construct something a little bit more formalized in terms of a data access layer using a new feature in VS 2005 we call the table adapter and type data sets. So basically to do that, I'm going to start off, I'm going to add a new item. And I'm going to go ahead and select the data set icon. And I can basically give this a name. I'm just going to call it Northwinds. And this will go ahead and add a Northwind class into my project. And it's going to go ahead and launch the data set designer. This data set designer does a couple of things. It lets me go ahead and model different schema types within my application. It also goes ahead and it allows me to build what are called table adapters, which basically can encapsulate the CRUD operations for manipulating and working against your data. So by default here, it's just going to go ahead and connect to that Northwind database that's already loaded. You'll notice it's going to prompt me to whether I want to save my connection string. By default, we actually store it in a web.config file, so it's not hard-coded in your code. One of the new features in ASP.NET 2.0 is that all sections in your web.config configuration file can now be strongly encrypted. So you can store it in an easy way. There's admin tool support within IIS to manage it, and you can also now encrypt it for when you go live in deployment. So I'm going to go ahead and just store it there. For connecting to the database, I can use either Sprox, or in this case here, I'm just going to go ahead and use ad hoc queries. And to start off with, I'm going to go against the products table. So I'm just going to use the query builder to add whatever tables I'm interested in. I'm going to pull back the product ID, the product name, supplier ID, category ID, unit price, and the units in stock. So whatever columns I really care about. And since this is going to return a lot of data, I'm going to add a where clause, and I'm just going to go ahead and add a filter so that I can actually filter based on the category ID of the product. And so to do that, I'm just going to say where category ID is equal to a category ID parameter we'll supply. I can name this method whatever I want. So in this case here, we'll just call it get products by category. And I can also, there's a checkbox here to automatically add insert, update, and delete statements based on that select. When I finish here, you'll see now I have a little products table adapter on my design surface with the columns that are being retrieved. And I have this method here that's encapsulating my SQL query. And if I want to just preview the data, I can go ahead and try it. Pull back all category 1, content, check out what it is. If I want to, I can then go ahead and add multiple different methods into this table adapter so I can retrieve the data with different filters or with different categories. If I want to see the categories as well on this design surface, I can go ahead and just say drag and drop the categories table on there. So I'm going to bring back basically the category ID and the category name. It'll show me the relationships between the different schemas. You can see there's a foreign key relationship here. If I preview the data for the categories, you'll see it's going to bring me back all unique category names and the category IDs. So, and obviously I can add a lot more stuff here in terms of methods. I can also go ahead and write logic for doing additional validation as part of this. I can basically go as far as I want in terms of taking advantage of this for a data access layer that I can work against. And now I have also then an API that I can go ahead and programmatically use within any page or any class to interact with the Northwind database. And the benefit is all the data access is encapsulated in the data access layer, so I'm not seeing any ADO.NET connection objects or having to work with connection strings or raw SQL directly. Instead, I can just say Northwinds.products and then call the get products by category ID method, pass in an integer of the category ID, and get back a strongly typed collection of the results. So now we're ready to go ahead and build some UI that goes against this data access layer. So there's a couple different ways I could go ahead and construct this UI. I could go ahead and just build lots of different pages that go against it. One of the new features that we added in ASP.NET 2.0, though, that I'm going to take advantage of here is a feature we call master pages. And the idea behind a master page is you can go ahead and define a common layout and a common look and feel across your site in a very easy way. And the way you do that is by adding a .master file into your site. You can name it whatever you want. In this case here, I'm just going to call it site.master. And what the master file does is it looks like a standard HTML file. The only difference is that you can also add, in addition to standard HTML and standard server controls, you can add a new control that's introduced in ASP.NET 2.0 we call the content placeholder. And basically what the content placeholder does is it identifies a region on the page that you can go ahead and replace the content for when you base a page on top of that master. So you can have any number of content placeholders you want anywhere within the HTML markup. And for each one that you have, you can then optionally go ahead and replace the content on a page that's based on the master. So for the purpose of this sample, I am going to actually add just an image and some style sheet, or some images in a style sheet that we can go ahead and use. And so here I'm just going to go ahead and add a style sheet at the top of the page. And I'm going to go ahead and add a header. And we'll call it the Northwind sample. I'm going to add another div that's going to basically be a placeholder for a menu that we're going to add a little bit later. And I'm just going to go ahead and surround this content placeholder with a div class, with a style sheet class called content. And what I end up with then is, standard kind of look and feel for a simple sample. One thing you'll notice as I'm moving around, VS will automatically highlight all the tags as your cursor's on it. You also have what we call the kind of breadcrumb control here to basically go ahead and navigate back and forth throughout your hierarchy. So some new features that you can take advantage of from a source editing perspective, et cetera. One other little trick, if you're new to VS 2005, it's a nice one, is if you flip back and forth between the designer, you'll notice that what's selected when you do that, for example, let's say the A in sample, it's the same thing that's selected when you go into source view. So it makes it very easy to flip back and forth between the two views. VS 2005 also never rearranges your HTML. Unfortunately, yeah. Sorry, yeah. Some say that's a feature, others call it a bug. a bug fix, but so I'm not going to claim that as a feature, but it's an important one. Yep. Yeah, good question. So the question is there a keyboard shortcut? You can actually use, yeah, F7 and Shift F7 and Control F7. Ooh, not that one. Yeah, you can basically use F7 to toggle back and forth. Control Shift F? Oh, Control Page Up. Yeah. Ooh. Yeah, and you can use that too. Cool. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, good question. So the question was, going back to the data access layer, can you go ahead and use stored procedures for, say, your insert, update, deletes? And the answer is yes. By default, when you go ahead and run through the wizard I just ran, it'll use the ad hoc SQL and generate insert, update, deletes as SQL commands. But you can actually go into any table adapter, and within the property grid, you can actually drill into what the insert, update, and delete methods are, and you can change those from being like text to being a stored procedure. Yes. Yeah. If you add a stored procedure, it'll reflect on the schema in the SQL database of the Sprock and automatically generate the parameters for you. Yeah.
Is it smart enough to understand your RI and insert and delete in proper order?
Is it smart enough to understand your?
If you define your relationships in here, is it smart enough to understand your RI?
Yeah. So it depends on the schema. So the question is it smart enough to always figure out based on your select statement what the insert update should be? Oh, if you want to do multiple insert updates? Oh, okay. It depends on the query. I mean, maybe afterwards we can chat and go into a couple specifics. Sure. Yep. Yes. Yeah. If you have a view instead of a table, you can go ahead and construct custom updates against the underlying table. There's a couple of ways also from the way you work with this data adapter. You can go ahead and just get sort of a single table. You can also go ahead and populate what's called a data set, where you can actually maintain the constraints and relationships between multiple tables. And so one thing you could do is you could go ahead, for example, in a master detail scenario, or let's say categories and products is a better example, since we have them up here. You go ahead and populate a local data set cache of those. Add a category, add a product with a relationship, even though it's a constraint. And then you can actually apply the updates for multiple together. And you can actually scope that within a single transaction. Don't ask me to code that because I'm not entirely sure, but I know you can do that. So anyway, moving on. Oh, the other question?
Would this work for ODBC data sources as well?
Yeah, so the question is, will this work with ODBC data sources as well? I believe yes is the answer. If you want to send me an email afterwards, I can follow up. There's nothing specific to SQL here. So I know it does work with Access, which I think is going through the OLADB adapter. But I believe you can also use it for other data sources as well. And one thing I should also mention is all the samples I'm going to show a little bit later in terms of how we're actually going to bind UI to data. Make no assumption that there's a data set involved. So this just happens to be a way you can build a data access layer. There's lots of different ways in .NET to do it. And there's lots of religious debates as to which is the best one. The nice thing that we have done is made sure that you're not forced to use a specific implementation of the data architecture. You can choose whether it's an OR mapper, you can choose something like this, you can choose an enterprise library, you can write custom ADO.NET code, and all the UI binding I'll show later will work with all those approaches. Okay, so we got a master page, we have a data access layer. Let's go ahead and build some stuff. Actually, the first thing I'm just going to do, even before I go ahead and show off or bind some data stuff, so I'm just going to build a simple hello page or home page for the site. Since I guess it's the Hello World app, we'll call it Hello World. This basically just shows off kind of master pages at a very simple level and how it works. So you can see here I have a default.aspx page. It's inheriting its master layout, so that's where the title and the menu's coming from. And then basically within that content placeholder, I can go ahead and put whatever content I want. And it will happen at design time, we merge them together, and also at runtime, when you go ahead and run this app, it'll go ahead and merge down and send back a single HTML stream. So for example, if we go ahead and just run this, you'll see I've created this project as a file system-based web in VS, which is a new option, doesn't require IIS. So it's launching its own default web server that ships with Visual Web Developer as well as VS 2005. A couple benefits of this: doesn't require admin privileges. You can run as a normal restricted user. It also works great in a lockdown environment. So anyway, you can see we send back a single HTML stream to the client, and the standard source that we define that gets included. Do you want me to use Firefox or IE? Safari. Yeah, thanks. Bring up your Mac later and we'll do it. One thing I'll just mention is you can you can use the browse with command in VS to actually configure what browser you want to launch anytime you run stuff. And you can change the default. So right now I have Firefox as the default. You can change it to anything but Firefox or Safari there. And so I'll just use Firefox, I guess, for the sample. One other thing I'll just mention about master pages that's kind of cool is that you can actually dynamically change the master on the fly. So if you do have a site that you potentially want to have very dynamic layout, you can actually programmatically at runtime go ahead and configure what master page you want to use, which is kind of a nice option. So the purposes here, though, we're going to go ahead and start off by just building a products page. And so I'm going to create it called products. I'm going to use the checkbox to say based on a master. It's going to list all the .master files in my project. Go ahead and create it. And in terms of this products page, I'm just going to do a couple things here. One is just surround this with a style sheet rule. I'm going to go ahead and, to begin with, add a category div that I can use to basically allow someone to pick a category. And what I want to do is basically have a drop-down list, or that's going to data bind against that data access layer and show all the unique categories within our Northwind database. So to do that, I can go ahead and use a drop-down list control built into ASP.NET 2.0 and ASP.NET 1.1. In this case here, I can then go ahead and bind it to data. So there's a couple different ways you can take that data and you can actually populate elements on the page. One is procedurally, I could go ahead and write code to do it. And so I could just set the data source property on the page and call data bind programmatically. Or there's also new features in 2.0 that make associating controls and binding them up to data much easier. And that's what I'm going to use here. And so I can go ahead and use the smart task to basically connect to a data source that we'll go ahead and define. There's a couple different data source objects that are built into 2.0. So I could bind to a database directly. I could data bind to the site navigation system, which we'll do later for menus, XML files, or in this case here, I can bind to a object. It's pluggable, so if you want to implement your own data sources, you can also add it to that window. A lot of the OR mappers and some of the more advanced business frameworks that are coming out now are actually shipping now with built-in data sources. So for example, you can go ahead and construct an OR mapper using, say, LLBGen, which is one of the popular .NET ones. And his new release in a couple days, or next month, you basically will have an LLBGen data source, and you can basically go through and just bind to the specific entities you want and declaratively do it that way. In this case here, I'm just going to go against an object. I could go, when I bind against an object, I can bind against any standard plain old object that has methods exposed for the common operations, getting data, updating data, inserting data, deleting data. Or I can bind, in this case here, I can bind directly against that data access layer that we built. So in this case here, I'm going to do that. If I'm going to build a slightly richer sample, what I'd probably do is surround it by a middle tier class that I build that would just be able to provide a little bit more encapsulation on top of the data access layer. But in this case here was binded to that categories table adapter that we built earlier. It's going to prompt me as to what methods I want to bind to for the different common operations. This is a drop-down list, so it doesn't really make sense to have insert, update, and deletes. So I can just nuke those out. But I do want to bind against that get data that's going to return the categories. I can then go ahead and choose what columns I want to map to different operations. So in this case here, I want to display the category name, but I want to use the category ID as the value. And now if I go ahead and run this, what I'll see is a drop-down list that's bound to the categories coming out of the data access layer. So going a little bit, making it a little bit richer. I can, drop down here, provide a grid view that's going to go ahead and display the actual selected products based on the category. So in this case here, I'll call this products header. And we'll just say add new product, or no, products. And then I can go ahead and use various different controls to basically display the data. If you're new to ASP.NET, there's lots of different kind of controls you can use. A simple one is the grid, which I'll just use here. There's also kind of a data list and a repeater control, which allows you to basically control exactly what UI is displayed. I'm going to use a CSS class called GridView. And I'm going to go ahead and set up an alternating rule class called even. So I can basically have each alternating item inside the grid have a slightly different color, or alternating colors. And I'm just going to turn off grid lines. And now what I can go ahead and do is, just like I could before, choose a data source to bind this control against. I'm also going to bind it against an object. In this case here, we'll bind it against the products table, or products data adapter. I am going to keep the update and the delete, get rid of the insert methods associated with this control. And then it'll say, hey, there's a category ID parameter to that method for that select statement that we defined. Where do I want to get the values from? I could pull it from a couple different places. I could write procedural code to do it. I could declaratively also then bind it from a cookie, a query string value, a profile, session, et cetera. In this case here, I'm just going to bind it against the control, which is the drop-down list control. Enable paging, sorting, editing, and deleting. We can go ahead and run now. And now I can basically filter based on the categories, define my data access layer within the database. I can page over the data. And if I want to, I can go ahead and edit any of the values, all in Firefox. And obviously I can sort as well. So anyways, this is sort of simple, binding the data. Let's go ahead now also add the ability to insert data. And so to do that, I could go ahead here, and have a insert link. And I'm just going to go ahead and add a link to a page we're going to build called insert.aspx. And I'm just going to go ahead and say add new product. And what this is going to do is just add some nice little UI here to allow me to go ahead and insert an item. And now I can go ahead and build the insert page. And here we'll go ahead and set up a rule like so. I'm going to go ahead and have a products header, just like we did before, to say add new products. And then to add a product, I can do a couple different controls. I could either have just sort of text boxes that I lay out directly. I'm going to use a details view control, which is just going to kind of provide a simple editing experience on top of either a record or on top of an object. Call it details view. It's the CSS class. Turn off grid lines. Looks like so. Can bind it against that same products table adapter that we defined earlier in our data access layer. Again, don't need update and I don't need delete. But I do want to keep the insert. I can enable inserting or editing and paging on this thing. So one nice thing about this control is you can bind it. If you have, say, a grid view on the same page, you can actually, as you're selecting an item in the grid, you can actually pull up the details and do a master details on the same page. In this case here, though, I just want to go ahead and just enable straight inserting. So I'm going to go ahead and modify this so that instead of just showing read-only data, I'm just always going to be in insert mode. And just so I can go ahead and write some code using C#, I'm just going to go ahead and add a label onto the page at the bottom here. And what I want to do is update this label every time a product is inserted successfully. And so a way I could go ahead and do that is, and one of the nice things about the data source controls is it provides me kind of a nice way that I can get a lot of functionality for free, but I can also go ahead and write events or methods that are going to get called at certain sequences when certain things happen. So for example, I could go ahead and say every time right before something is inserted, the inserting event will fire and I could write some custom validation. And when the insert operation completes, the inserted event will fire, and I can figure out status and take action accordingly. And this allows me to kind of nicely separate out my code from my actual markup and my content and behavior. So in this case here, I'm just going to go ahead and add an inserted event, which it will fire after the inserting operation occurs. As part of this event, it gets passed in two parameters. One is the actual object that raised the event, and the other one is what we call an event args object, which has information specific to the event. And so, for example, I could go ahead and check to see if e.exception is null, meaning no exception was thrown by that data access layer. Go ahead and update that label to say product added, like so. Now when I go ahead and run the page, I create a new product called Vegas Baby. How much? I don't know. It's priceless, right? There's only one. I can go ahead and insert. Basically, we called the insert method on our data access layer. It succeeded because no exception was raised, so that event handler caused the product added to be listed. Does that make sense? It does take, I mean, it does, there's, one of the things that we're actually working on right now is a really good 38-part tutorial that someone's writing, which basically walks through kind of every common scenario with data operations using these data source controls. I think the first segment should appear in the next 2 weeks, I think, on the web. And once you understand which event, the event sequence and kind of how you can use these particular controls, I think one of the things you'll find is they're super powerful and they save a ton of time in terms of doing common data operations. So anyway, now if I go back to our grid view here, sort somewhere here. There it is. I guess we've got a filter going on. There's our Vegas Baby event, record that we just added. We could change it. So we want to change number of items in stock. We could also go ahead and delete it. And so now we have very simple insert, update, delete, sorting, paging, editing on top of a products table using a filter based on the category. Any questions on that? Yeah?
Just one, when you brought the details view up there, the first thing you did was delete some of the style stuff.
Yeah, that's a good, that's a good question. So basically, what I'm trying to do in this talk is actually not use any inline styles and do everything through CSS. For some reason, by default, when you drag and drop from the toolbox into source view, we add a default width and height for the details view. Not for any other control, but for the details view we do. You can actually go into the toolbox probably and clear that out. But that was the thing I deleted when I added it. So rather than hard code in the width and height on the element, I'm basically just pulling it up from the CSS style rule.
Yeah, I appreciate using styles. I just don't appreciate that it puts the stuff in. It seems like efficient, 2003 did that a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot better now than we used to. There's still a few cases where we do. We're trying to be much better. The next release also, we're kind of really trying to push CSS more. We're not pushing it enough right now, but that's certainly the direction that we're going. And you will see, especially in the next release of VS, very, very rich CSS editing support. That's the biggest feature item we're working on for the designer. And so you'll see us actually kind of deprecate inline styles entirely in favor of CSS in a big way. Okay, so anyway, so we got simple products editing going on there. One other thing I just want to talk about a little bit with data access is a new feature, or a feature we call caching. So how many people are using caching today? A few people. Cool. It's a really easy feature to use, and it provides a tremendous amount of power. So if you're not using it today, I definitely recommend block off half an hour, and take a look at it, because you can really dramatically improve your performance in a number of ways with it. So just to show that kind of off, we're going to go ahead and build another page for our site that I'm just going to call cache test. And what we're going to do in this cache test page is, go ahead and say products. I'm going to go ahead and just have a output header that's going to spit out date time. So I could either go ahead and programmatically do this, or I'm just going to use the datetime.now property with an inline element like so. And then I'm just going to go ahead and add a grid view onto the page like we did before. And we'll just make this look a little attractive. There we go. And let's just go ahead and bind this up to that same object that we did earlier. And in this case here, I'm going to go ahead and, I don't need insert, update, deletes. Rather than pull something from a drop-down list, I'm just going to pull the category ID value from a query string. And I'll just call it cat ID. And I'll default it to 1 if nothing's specified. Anyway, so now I have a simple grid bound to the same objects that we had earlier. And we'll call the CSS class grid view. So now when I go ahead and run this page, you see I have the same values that we see on that other page going on the page. Let's turn off grid lines so it's a little bit more attractive in Firefox. There we go. So the feature with caching, so one of the things you'll notice every time I hit refresh on this page is that that timestamp is updating at the top. And that's basically because I'm not caching this page, so every request from any browser hitting it is going to go ahead and cause this page to execute, re-render, and be displayed. So the way caching works in ASP.NET is it provides basically a way you can go ahead and say, don't regenerate something every time. Instead, go ahead and cache it and reuse it for later requests. And there's a variety of different ways that you can go ahead and configure it. You can cause it to be an item to be cached programmatically, so you can write code based on some condition. You can also go ahead and cause content to be cached declaratively. So in this case here, I'm going to go ahead and set up an output cache of, say, 5 seconds. And I'm going to say vary it based on the cat ID parameter. So now I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page. You'll notice when I'm hitting refresh for 5 seconds, the time isn't changing. And then it does. And that's basically because during that 5-second window, any request, whether it's from this browser or any other browser that hits the site, it's going to go ahead and pull this item, this output from the cache and basically send it back. So the benefit is I'm not hitting the database tons and tons of time. Instead, I'm only having to hit it every 5 seconds. It can dramatically improve your performance. And so and this all ships with ASP.NET V1.1 today. You can do this at a full page level. You can also identify regions of a page that you want to go ahead and cache. So a more common case might be cache the menu or cache just this portion of the product's catalog, but not the shopping cart portion. Question? Yeah, the question is, what about the master page? Yeah, you can also cache the master page or regions within the master page. There's also a new feature in ASP.NET 2.0 we call kind of nugget caching, where you actually say cache all of the surrounding portion of the page, but make this inner portion of the page dynamic. So that's a new feature that's supported as well. The downside with this approach is if I'm caching this thing for 5 seconds, what happens if the database changes in the meantime? 5 seconds is probably not a big issue, but let's say it was longer, like 555,000 seconds. And you run into this issue with caching where you might be displaying stale data to your users. So what we did in ASP.NET 2.0 is added a new feature we call SQL cache invalidation. And what that does is it basically says you can say cache this thing for 555,000 seconds, or if the underlying database that it's based on is modified, in which case immediately invalidate it, and on the next request, go ahead and regenerate it. And so to configure that, it's pretty easy to do. I can go ahead and all I need to do to enable it is to basically configure my database to support caching. And so there's a command line utility that ships with ASP.NET called ASP.NET Reg SQL. You can point at a database and indicate what tables you want ASP.NET to watch. And it'll go ahead and set up the appropriate settings. And then you can go ahead and inside your web.config file, inside here, you can go ahead and add a caching section. And there's different ways you can configure caching in .NET 2.0. One way is a polling-based mechanism. And so that's what I'm actually going to use here just for simplicity's sake. This will work against SQL 2000 as well as 2005. You can also go ahead and use the same technique, and you have to write a little bit more code, but you can enable it with Oracle or MySQL or any other database you want. It's not tied to SQL. Basically, the way this works is you go ahead and you point at your connection string. So in this case here, I'm going to use the Northwind connection string that we built during a data access layer. And you can go ahead and say, I want you to monitor this database and check it every second to see whether or not any of the underlying tables change. So this is not per page. This is basically ASP.NET will once a second or whatever the poll time is, go ahead and check the database to see whether or not any of the underlying table schema changed. We're not doing a query against it. We're just basically checking a trigger to see whether or not something's modified. So this works with SQL 2000 and 2005. Alternatively, you can go ahead with SQL 2005 and you can use a push-based model where you can go ahead and have the SQL database actually push a notification to ASP.NET. So instead of actually having to check it, poll it, you can basically get sent a notification anytime an underlying row or table changes. So you can do row level invalidation. So anyway, so once I have this set up, I can then go back to our page here and I can go ahead and say add a SQL dependency on the products table. And now I'm going to go ahead and hit refresh. And it'll cache this page for 555,000 seconds, or if the underlying database changes. So now you notice the timestamp isn't updating. Go back here, though, and we change Outback Logger. I don't know what that is. But update that column over here, hit refresh. You notice the timestamp changes, and the data changed live. And so now we're apple-caching this page. We won't hit the database for this page, for at least a day, except if the underlying database changes. So really easy way you can go ahead and dramatically lower the costs on your SQL database while still preserving the freshness of your data. And you can do this declaratively. You can also programmatically encapsulate it within your middle tier or your data access layer as well. Yeah. Yeah, good question. So is this cached in memory? By default, the answer is yes. It caches in memory. There is actually a utility that we shipped in January which provides a disk-based cache module. So you can also cache it to disk. And it provides even more ways you can go ahead and cache. And so it can basically spool it out to disks. One nice benefit of ASP.NET 2.0 is it's 64-bit enabled, which means you can basically take advantage of a full 64-bit address space. The big benefit of the 64-bit address space in the web scenario is with caching. So you can now cache gigabytes of content if you want. You can also automatically vary caches based on, say, the role that a user's logged in as, or any other custom cache policy that you want. You can do lots of custom stuff. You can also, when you insert something in the cache, write your own cache invalidation object. So you don't have to just do it with the database. We have a built-in database, file system, and timer-based invalidations. But it's pluggable, so you can go ahead, if you want to have a web service cause the cache to invalidate, go for it. All that support's built in. So anyways, that's caching. So one downside right now with our system is you'll notice it's sort of hard to navigate. I can easily add a new product, but if I want to go back, there's no easy way to do it. What I want to go ahead and do is actually now provide a menu. And so to do that, I can take advantage of some new features in ASP.NET 2.0 that make kind of navigation and across the site much easier. And so specifically, I can use a feature we call a site navigation object or site navigation system. And basically, this is an API that allows you to encapsulate the structure of your site and specifically where the browser visiting that within that site is within that structure. You can store that structure in multiple different places. So in this case here, I'm just going to use an XML file to define the link structure on the site. We also shipped on the web what we call a SQL table provider, where you can go ahead and actually encapsulate this link structure within a database. So you can do like a CMS-style database to structure your layout and structure your content. So what I can go ahead and do here is just define within this site map XML file that I have a default.aspx page, which is my home. I have a products.aspx page, which is my products data. And we have that insert.aspx page, which is for add new product. I can put whatever other links I want within there. And I'll come back later when we talk about roles and talk about some of the other things you can do to hide and show things based on role capabilities. So anyway, so storing that in the sitemap file means I can now go ahead and programmatically say sitemap dot, and anywhere within the site, I can basically see where is the current user accessing this request in that sitemap navigation hierarchy. So if I say sitemap.currentNode, it'll return back a node object telling me here's where the user is, here's what the parent links are, here's what the sibling links are, and here's what the child links are. And get access to the URL information, the accessibility of it, whether or not they should show or hide depending on the role, et cetera. So some useful stuff. Makes it a lot easier to go ahead and build kind of menu systems and breadcrumbs and stuff like that. So I can either write code programmatically. I can alternatively also use some of the built-in navigation controls that ship as part of ASP.NET V2. So for example, we have a built-in menu as well as a built-in tree view. I can data bind this against anything I want to. So I can data bind against the data access layer, or in this case here, I'm just going to data bind against the site navigation system directly. And I can go ahead and format it. So I can make it look like, you know, my inbox, my event viewer, your MSN Messenger. In this case here, let's make it simple. And now, I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. You'll notice I now have a menu system. You know, it does client-side JavaScript, so it doesn't have to post back to expand and collapse. And I can now easily navigate around the site. You'll notice as I don't have, so for example, you'll notice this products is currently highlighted because that's the current node. You'll notice if I use the add new product link to go to the add new product page, the add new product link is now highlighted. And that's because I have a logical structure of what my sitemap looks like, and it can just tell whether or not it's on the current node or not and take appropriate behavior action. A couple other things about the menu controls is they can use kind of AJAX-based callbacks, so that if you have a lot of hierarchy, rather than have to dump a whole bunch of it in a menu, you can basically go ahead and just selectively retrieve the appropriate values as someone drills down into the menu hierarchy. So it makes it much more efficient. One of the other things that we're doing, so one gripe that people have had about the tree view control in particular, as well as the menu control, is that they don't use ULLI elements to represent the structure. Instead, they often use tables, which people hate if you're a CSS person. We are shipping a CSS table CSS adapters for these controls in about 3 weeks on the web, which will go ahead and modify this content so that it is ULLI based, and you can use standard CSS menuing techniques in order to stylize it. And the controls will still encapsulate all of the behavior for navigation. Any questions on navigation? Yeah.
Could you just say that one more time about what's available in 3 weeks?
Okay, yeah, sorry. What's available in 3 weeks is, by default right now, this tree view is using tables for markup, which anyone who uses CSS knows is bad. So what we're shipping in 3 weeks is what we call a control adapter, which is a built-in extensibility mechanism in ASP.NET 2.0, which allows you to modify the markup output of any control. And so we're going to ship CSS-based control adapters for the menu, the tree view, and a whole bunch of other controls. And what those do, and you can just use them without having to write any code. You can just use CSS to stylize them. We'll also ship the source code to those control adapters. So if you want to have some custom modifications or some custom output that you want from a control, you can just take those samples, tweak what you want the output to look like, and then any control that you use on your site by default will have that output. I'm sorry, yeah, I mean HTML. Yeah, we're using HTML tables. Yeah, there's no relational table in that tree view. Yeah.
With the sitemap format,
Yep.
Can you define an editor for that format type?
Yeah, so the question is for the sitemap format, so for example, this file right here, could you identify an editor other than the built-in XML editor for modifying it? Yeah, the answer is yes. You can actually in VS associate any editor you want. And the VS extensibility mechanism would allow you to, for example, to build your own custom editor on top of it. We wanted to, but ran out of time. And also, again, the nice thing about the site navigation system, and especially when I go in a few minutes and add membership and role support to the site, is it's built on this extensibility mechanism we call the provider model, which means that all of the APIs for site navigation and all the menu controls know nothing about this XML format. Instead, they program against a site navigation provider, and we just happen to ship an XML site navigation provider in the box. And so if you go ahead and add, for example, a SQL provider for the site navigation system, which you can actually download for free with source code, then you can go ahead and use the same menu system, the same APIs that I showed here, but instead of going into this XML file, you could go against a database or a MySQL database or SQL database to retrieve your link hierarchy information. And one nice thing about the SQL sitemap provider that we have on the web is it also uses that SQL cache invalidation mechanism. So we only have to grab that site navigation data once, and then unless the link structure changes in the database, we don't have to go back and requery it. So it's very efficient. So anyway, so there is some method to our madness when we design features in terms of how they interrelate, usually. So anyway, so we have some site navigation. Let's go ahead and actually add security to this site. So ASP.NET ships with a very rich security authentication system. There's multiple ways you can plug in, and there's a lot of depth in terms of the features that you can take advantage of. One of the things that we can go ahead and do is, always upsets me that we stick a whole bunch of default comments and stuff in our file. So let me get rid of some of these things. But anyways, basically you can go ahead and control what mode of authentication you want to use within your site. By default, we support Windows authentication, which uses the built-in Windows challenge response mechanism for identifying users. You can also go ahead and enable what we call forms authentication. If you're familiar with ASP.NET v1.1, this is the same forms authentication we ship there, although there's a few extra features that we've added in 2.0. What I can then go ahead and do is I can go ahead and build, say, a login page to provide the ability for someone to go ahead and log into the site. And so there's a couple different ways I could do it. So one approach would be to add kind of a standard username password text box mechanism. I could either go ahead and roll my own database and store my credentials in whatever data storage I want to. In v2.0, we've also added what we call a membership API and define another way you can do it, which is basically you can just say membership.validateUser, and then you could go ahead and provide a username password combination. And if that returned true, then you could go ahead and log them in the site. And the way the membership APIs work is they're, again, provider-driven, which means that you can go ahead inside that web.config file, register different membership credential providers to go authenticate a specific set of credentials against different data stores. So out of the box, we ship a SQL membership provider, so you can go against a SQL or SQL Express-based membership system. We ship an Active Directory provider, so you can go against a Windows Active Directory or against an LDAP store. And we ship samples. We're actually going to ship both those providers as source code that you can go ahead and use. We also ship samples for access. There's also on the web, you can download MySQL providers that are pre-built, Oracle providers that are pre-built, and 2 or 3 other database formats as well. And so if you have an existing database credential store, you can go ahead and download those, tweak them to go against your existing schema, register them in your web.config file, and then anywhere within your site, you can use the membership API, and it'll delegate through to your provider and access your authentication store. So it's a very easy way you can go ahead and plug in any authentication system into your app. And we have nice membership APIs to go ahead and do it. If you're really lazy, which I am, you can also just cheat, and rather than have to build your own login UI, you could just go ahead and, let's say, add a div and use some of the built-in login UI controls that we also provide in the box. So for example, the ASP login control. And we'll go ahead and stylize the title. And what this does is it basically provides me with a built-in login UI that uses the membership APIs that'll then use your registered membership provider to go ahead and authenticate the user. And so without having to write your own custom validation for UI elements and things like that, it provides all the basics for you. So anyone have a username? Not all at once. Bill G, okay. Hi, Bill. So I can go ahead and try to log in Bill. Sure, remember his password. What this is actually doing under the covers right now, the first time we access this, is it is by default going to dynamically provision a SQL Express database with the appropriate membership schema for usernames and passwords, and then it's going to go ahead and try to log Bill G in. And this is probably going to fail because we're building this Hello World app from scratch, and so there's no users or passwords in the actual system. So come back in a little bit when SQL Express is finished provisioning and tell me it failed. So if you actually want to see what's happening under the covers, by default, we actually will create this data inside this app_data directory. Again, it's just provider-driven, so if you update the config file to point to a remote database, it'll go against that instead. And now when we come back here, hey, the login attempt wasn't successful. That's because we now have a blank membership system. There is no Bill G user. So let's go ahead and build a registration page. We do have a web-based UI, which I'll show later, for managing users and passwords that you can use instead. In this case here, though, I'm just going to go ahead and build a register.aspx page. Again, I could use the membership APIs directly, or we could just use the create user control. And what the create user control does is it provides me UI for pulling up the various values of that I want from the login process. It's also subclasses the wizard control, which is also a new control that's built into V2. And so one of the nice things about it is you can actually add your own steps as part of the registration process. So if you want to figure out what state they're from, or what gender they're at, or what their favorite color is, or whatever kind of additional personalized steps you want, you can very easily add it, and it provides the next previous navigation wizard for collecting that data and maintaining the state for you. And then you can just write an event at the end to basically, after you create the user, take all of their settings and store it, say, for example, in the new ASP.NET 2.0 profile store. Yeah? Well, if you're using forms authentication, it'll work with any browser.
Yeah, but on the server side, what about the rendering the client side? So if you do confirm password where you're going to insert the text boxes.
Right. You should be able to, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah, I think you were talking about the validation controls in ASP.NET in 1.1 support both server-side and client-side validation. That's somewhat different from authentication. That's sort of data validation. In ASP.NET 2.0, they work with Firefox just fine. So they'll do client-side validation on Firefox as well. And so this control does that built in as well. So for example, if we want to go ahead and just on the login page, let's just go ahead and point users at, register new user. We'll point them at the register.aspx page. Now, if I want to go ahead here and create build G, build G at Microsoft.com. Any security question for Bill to recover his password? Favorite competitor? It's a career-limiting move. Favorite city? Vegas. We'll go ahead. We've created Bill in the system, and we're now logged on. And just to show it, we could go ahead here and let's say we'll go back to our site master page. We go ahead here, and in our header, let's just go ahead and add a what's CSS class name? Oh, login status. Code's easy to remember. I can go ahead, and I'm going to provide a simple link to log in and log out the user. There's a control here I can use called login status that'll do it. I can spit out the login name. We're just going to go ahead and say welcome user. Oops. Like so. And now you can see in the top right, hopefully, it says welcome Bill G, and it has a logout link. And so now if I go ahead and log Bill out, hey, it goes back. If I go ahead and log him back in, he's logged in. So we've implemented kind of a secure authentication system. The membership providers we ship out of the box implement best practices, so all passwords are salted. We don't store anything in clear text. And we also implement a recovery mechanism, as you can see, in terms of if someone wants to recover their password, we can do that. We can go ahead and lock out accounts based on failed login attempts. So you can say, hey, after 5 failed attempts, log them out, force an admin to go ahead and unlock them. Kind of hopefully security best practices all around. You don't have to worry about. So even though it looks almost kind of drag drop wizardy-like, it's a very powerful membership system you can take advantage of. And one thing I was mentioning is the beauty is because it's built on the provider model, if you want to swap out our default schema or our default semantics in the credential system, you can do that. And everything I just showed you from a productivity perspective, you get for free. Just implement the membership contract, which you can do by subclassing the membership provider base class. Implement the methods you want or override those methods you care about. And everything I showed you, you get for free, including the admin tool, which I'll show in a second, for managing users and roles, because it just uses the provider contract as well. Yes. What's the benefit? Yeah. Yeah. So the question over in the front here was, hey, I noticed when you click on this control, there's an option here where you can basically say convert to template. The idea here is rather than, so for example, right here, I'm basically, you can see we don't really have anything other than ASP login and some CSS on that control. And it's basically providing all the built-in UI for me. That works for some cases. It's great for just getting started and showing a client what it's going to look like. If you want to go ahead and really customize it, though, you can also go ahead and what's called convert to template, where it'll actually take the built-in look and feel and actually expand it out for you, so you can actually go in and tweak it yourself. And so all the semantics for validation and things like that are still built in, but it basically gives you access to the raw controls that it's using internally to render the UI, and you can now go ahead and tweak it to your heart's content, make it look however you want, but still maintain that encapsulated behavior. And so it's basically, if you want to customize the look and feel to make it richer, is when you'd want to do that.
How does that scale? What's the largest height and numbers that are using the default profile?
How well does it scale? I know of several multi-million user sites. Not for membership. Membership's a pretty straight lookup. You're talking about profile, I think, maybe? Yeah, so the profile feature is slightly different. The membership system should scale to tens of millions. I mean, it's basically, you're only limited by your database, but it's a very fast integer-based user ID lookup. So it's pretty fast. There is a profile system, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And again, it's provider-driven. The default provider in the database actually scales very well to users. The challenge is if you want to do rich querying against that data, that's where you actually start to run into issues. There's another provider you can use, which is the SQL table provider, which provides a little bit more richer schema mapping. And if you're going to do rich data mining on your data, I'd recommend using that provider instead. Again, the API is the same. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So the question is, could you extend data elements that when you want to add a new user, you want to store not just username, password recovery, and things like that, but you want to store their zip code or their department or organization. Yeah. You can extend the membership provider. What we typically recommend, though, is we have another feature in ASP.NET 2.0 called Profile. And what you do there is you can basically have per user profile data. And the nice thing is you can abstract that from your actual credential store and store it in a different place. So a common scenario we see is people might want to authenticate using Active Directory, but we want to use a profile database to store their department information, because you might or might not have write access to the Active Directory for storing that type of thing. So the profile feature is the one I'd recommend for that. And afterwards I can show you an article. I have a good sample on my blog that actually walks through walking through the registration process, storing profile data using the wizard control to capture it. So anyways, this is sort of we got login management going on now. The other thing we can go ahead and take advantage of in ASP.NET 2.0 is roles. And so, we kind of view membership as providing a way you can go ahead and provide authentication, identifying who a user is. We then have a system we call roles, which allows you to actually group capabilities about that user in rich ways. And so what I'm just going to go ahead and do is I launched the built-in web admin tool that ships with ASP.NET 2.0. It provides kind of a security management UI in a web kind of way. So you can see, for example, we now have one user in our system. And if we want to, we could go ahead and manage Bill, and we could lock him out and do fun things to him. Let's not do that. So we'll just go back. What I'm going to go ahead and do is use this admin tool to enable role-based security. So I can click the Enable Roles. This will go ahead and provision the role schema inside our SQL Express database. And then I can go ahead and create or disable roles within my application. So I could create roles like friends or any suggestion on role names? Enemies? I'm going to map Bill into that. Okay. Yeah, okay. We'll do enemies and administrators. That way we can have some fun. Administrators. So anyway, so we can go ahead and create any number of roles we want. We can then go ahead and when we go to manage people, we can go ahead and, for example, look up Bill, and we can add him into the administrator's role. And so now he's in the administrator role. We can now go ahead and do some interesting things on our site to take advantage of that. So one thing we could do is let's go ahead and on the home page, rather than just say hello world. One thing is you can obviously use the design surface to drag and drop controls. The only reason I'm using source view is I don't want to appear like, hey, it's completely oblivious what's happening. So you know, if you rather a WYSIWYG kind of approach, just flip to design view and you can do everything I'm doing as well. But in this case here, I'm just going to use a control that's new in ASP 2.0 called the login view control. And what this is going to let me do is it's a templated control. So I can say, hey, I don't know you yet. And so the idea with a templated control is you can have different content depending on what role or what status someone is on the site. So if they're not logged in, I can go ahead and say, I don't know you. If they are logged in, I can say, I know you, but you aren't an admin or enemy. And then I could also go ahead and have a role group where I could have different content depending on what role someone's in. So for example, I could add a role group for administrators. And I could just have different content here that says, hi, admin. And let's just put H1 around all of this in the interest of time. So now, for example, when Bill's on the site, go back here. Because he's logged, I think the session is now he's logged in, and he's in the admin role. It says, hi, admin. If I log him out, it's going to say, I don't know you, because he's now anonymously on the site. If I go back to the web admin tool and bump him out of the admin role, and then have him log in, I know you, but you're not an admin or an enemy. Again, if we promote him to be an admin, oops, it's confusing because I keep switching the wrong tab. I promote him to be an admin, he's now an admin. So this is an easy way I can go ahead and have different content on the site, vary depending on what role someone is mapped into. Roles can be kept separately from your membership data. So if you're in an enterprise organization, maybe you're storing your username and passwords in an LDAP system or an Active Directory architecture, you can store your roles in an app-specific database. So you don't have to actually change your master tree forest AD thing in order to actually update your application. Question? Is there an easy way to tie in the roles to? Yeah, so is there an easy way to tie in the roles to the menu? The answer is yes. You can actually enable a feature we call security trimming. So you can go ahead and we'll automatically look at what ACL permissions a user has and show or hide elements in the menu depending on it. The nice thing is we don't do it at the menu level, we do it at the site navigation level. So anything that uses the site navigation API will take advantage of it. We can also, I'll tell you what I'll do. Let me quickly, just because we're running a little bit on time, I'll get your question in just a second. I could also do something like, for example, on the products page, I could go ahead and vary, for example, whether someone has delete permissions on a grid view, depending on what role they're in as well. So for example, I could say if user.isInRole administrators, or if, well, in this case, I'm going to say if they're not in a user is enroll administrators, which is probably not the best, most secure way to do that. But in the interest of time, we'll do that. I'm just going to go ahead and pull out from the grid view its command field column, which is where the the delete button is. And for example, I could go ahead and say show delete button equals false, and I could say hide the edit button is false as well. And so now when I go ahead and run this page, you can see Bill is in the administrator role, so we are going to go ahead and let him see that. If we go ahead, though, and pull up, for example, the configuration tool and knock him out of that role, there. Yes. Correct. Yeah, correct. Yeah, by default, unless you turn off event validation. So by default, it'll block anyone from trying to do the, we do kind of a defense in depth. So now, for example, when I do refresh on this page, oops. Oh, sorry. Lots of features you can take advantage of. Now we can go ahead and remove them from the administrator's role. And now when we go back to this page, if I go ahead and hit refresh, you'll see Bill no longer has edit or delete permissions on the grid. This is UI level validation, which is good, or UI level security. You should also go ahead and at your data access layer, your business access layer, check it as well. One nice thing about .NET is it flows role context throughout the call. So in other words, throughout the lifetime of the request, in any business object, you can check to see whether someone's in role access. There's also a metadata attribute you can apply on a class or a method level that'll actually enforce at the type object system whether or not a particular class can be instantiated unless the caller is in a specific role. And it all ties into this ASP.NET system. So you can go ahead and do defense in depth in multiple places doing role checks. Yep. Good question. So the question is, can you also then go below roles and have permissions? So you can say someone's in a particular role, but they have or don't have permission to edit or delete an item. We don't in the built-in SQL role provider. What you can do, though, is you can use the Atom provider, which is the Active Directory application mode, something. Someone was joking yesterday, when we finally ship Atlas, what will we call it? It'll probably be like the Microsoft, dynamic language with tag element thing for making stuff dynamic. Will probably be the name, the descriptive name. But anyway, the Atom system does allow you to do capability permissions. And so you can go ahead and use the Atom provider. It's a little bit, it's not as cleanly integrated as we'd like it to be. It's something we're going to do in the future. But you can certainly use it and do programmatic checks. I'm going to come back to your question just a little bit because we have 6 minutes and 7 seconds left, and we want to build some portal UI. So anyway, so we have a security system on here. Let's go ahead and just do the last sort of step to take advantage of it, which is to go ahead and build a nice kind of little portal UI that people can see when they go ahead and visit the site, and basically suck them in and make stuff look cool. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to nuke the default page that we've been working on. And I'm just going to go ahead and, since we're in the interest of time, just in case a few files here that I will cheat, and I'm just going to add, basically I'm going to add some user controls, which we'll come back to in just a second, which are ways you can go ahead and create your own controls very easily in a declarative WYSIWYG fashion that you can reuse on the site. I'm going to register them on this page. A new feature in ASP.NET 2.0 is you can also now register controls in the web.config file. So if you want to go ahead and register them for an entire site, it's really easy to do that as well. Yeah, that's cool. And so now what I've done also then is I've added, in this case here I'm using a table, you could also use a div, and then I have what's called a web part zone control, and a couple of them on the page. And what these do is they basically provide a container layout for doing portal style UI. So for example, you'll see when I go ahead and flip into design mode, I right now have a breaking news, a market statistics, and then some other control on the bottom there. And I have this catalog zone where I can go ahead and add and remove modules to and from the page. And so if I go ahead and run this, it's going to fail. It's because this is by design because I forgot to add one other thing, which is when I want to use a web part zone, I'm going to go ahead and add a ASP web part manager control onto the page called web part manager 1. And now what will happen is you can see basically I have kind of a nice view of a couple of different modules of content displayed on the page. I could build my own set of my own control really easily. So for example, we'll just do that. I can basically just say add new user control. We'll call it Scott. I could go ahead and bind a grid, just like we did earlier, of data. We'll bind it. In this case here, I'm just going to bind to say the categories object or something lame, but simple. So anyway, if I want to go ahead and bind this data here, just going to make it colorful. And if I want to then use it on this page, I could very easily do that. We'll just go ahead and add the Scott control at the bottom there. Hit refresh. And there's my control. So it's very easy to go ahead and build new modules that plug in onto that page. And then what's cool is I can go ahead and enable a personalization option So if someone's logged in, they can actually customize the appearance and the layout of the page itself. And with ASP.NET 2.0, we provided kind of built-in drag-drop customization for enabling this with IE. With the Atlas release that we just shipped on Monday, we've also then made it work in Firefox. And so that's what I'm going to go ahead and do now. So the way you make it work in Firefox, and I'm going to do a blog post on this, so don't try to remember these special little commands, is you basically go into your web.config file, and you can go ahead and map the built-in ASP.NET Web Part Zone Manager to work against the new Atlas one. You don't need to change any code. You just basically go ahead and it's a config setting. And then you can go ahead and add, in this case here, the Atlas script manager to the page. Let's go ahead and refresh to make sure this is still working. And then what I want to basically do, whoops, no. You notice a very descriptive error message. You must put it before the other thing. And yet I still screwed it up. Let's put it in that order. And what this is basically going to go ahead and do is I'm now Atlas enabling the Web Part Manager. And now I can go ahead and add a little bit of code onto the page to allow someone to customize the look and feel. And the way I'm just going to do that is I'm going to go ahead and add a div called Customize. And then I'm going to go ahead and add a button, or link button here, which I'm just going to call Customize. And when someone presses this link button, I'm going to go ahead and handle this event in my code behind. And I'm going to tell the Web Part Manager on the page to go into a mode that we call, or display mode that we call catalog display mode. And now when I go ahead and run this page, if I log in as Bill, and I customize it, I can now go ahead and drag and drop, oops. I can now go ahead and, oops. Yeah, and there is actually one bug I should mention that I discovered late last night. It's not with ASP.NET 2.0, it's actually with the current Atlas drop, which is you actually do need to, unfortunately, be in debug mode or have debug enabled to actually enable the drag drop to work in Firefox. I have no idea why that would possibly have caused that behavior to occur. Currently in active discussion with the developer who wrote that to understand, but we'll get that, obviously get that fixed. But now I want to go ahead and customize. A little bit better now, you can go ahead and drag and drop the UI for any of the elements that you want to allow customization for on the page. And when you close it, it'll go ahead and actually save all of the customized settings in the ASP.NET Profile Store, which is new in ASP.NET 2.0. And now anytime that user goes ahead and visits that page again, they'll see the exact same customized settings when they log in. So for example, if I log out, I'm going to see the default look and feel the developer specified. If I go ahead and log in, I see the settings that we previously customized. And I can add and remove modules that I want to. You can, on a per module or per control basis, indicate whether they can be removed or changed based on a role or based on whether or not someone's logged in. So you can say only an admin can go ahead and change this or not. And obviously, you can write code and do whatever you want in terms of adding richer validation as well. Yeah, good question. So does this work with, this sounds like web parts, or the name is web parts. How does this relate to SharePoint? You can actually go ahead now and in ASP.NET 2.0 write a web part that will work in SharePoint. And so what we've done is we've worked very closely with the SharePoint team and unified the concept of web parts. So if you just want to build a custom app like I did right here, great. You can go ahead and build a web part and plug it in like I did with that user control, with that data operation. You can also, though, take that same control, deploy it on a SharePoint server or a content management server, and basically use all the built-in CMS and portal features of SharePoint itself. And it's the same programming model. You write the same code. You could use the same data access layer I used, and away you go. So a little bit out of time. I'm going to go ahead and I'll stay around and answer questions as long as you have. But hopefully what you've seen here is kind of you can build apps pretty fast, pretty quick. You can use standards-based CSS. And it's not just about productivity. It's about also the layers I described below in terms of caching, in terms of the provider model, in terms of the authentication subsystem, et cetera. You can go ahead and drop down, really customize the heck out of everything. all this stuff I showed is free. You can do everything I showed in the free development tool. And obviously in Visual Studio Team System and Visual Studio Pro, there's a lot more features that if I had many more hours, I could go ahead and show. But hopefully you can see there's a lot of fun stuff to take advantage of. So thanks a bunch.